Chapter 49, April 25th, 1943, Warsaw. The truck drove us 15 minutes from where we had escaped the sewers to a farmhouse on a quiet hill where we were quietly ushered into an attic room. There were no windows up there, but even then, the farmer, a shy-eyed man who couldn't have been any older than Dolek, would have been lit only a few candles and asked us to keep our voices low, a warning that was hardly necessary. Soon after, a Catholic priest and a pretty girl, I assumed was the farmer's wife, entered with trays of hot stew and fresh bread and real milk. The aroma of the food nearly overwhelmed me as I realized for the first time how little I'd eaten all week, surviving on crusts of rusk bread, a bowl of cold soup, and more raw nerves than I thought I had. It wasn't just me. Most of us accepted the bread and milk, but looked at the stew as if it was too much to manage all at once. I noticed the children broke their slice of bread in half, stuffing the rest into their coats. One day they would remember again what it is to have enough food. But that would take time. We were also provided with new clothes, Polish-looking clothes, though I couldn't imagine where they'd come from. I was more than happy to get rid of the ones I'd worn so far, too many days, stained with sweat and blood, torn and smelling of gunpowder, sewage, and death. "We have a few blank identification papers," the farmer said, "and we'll find safe houses for all of you until this terrible war comes to an end. There are many of us in Warsaw who want to help." If he'd already arranged for safe houses, then he'd done my job, which meant it was time to move on. When I walked past the priest, he noticed my necklace with the Catholic crucifix. "Ah," he said, "I'm a courier," I said, proud of the title, proud of who I was. He nodded respectfully. "Then you have seen too much of this war." "I have seen too much of a war that reveals people for who they truly are." "Indeed it has." He stared at me, the corners of his eyes glistening in the candlelight. "Some are revealed as cowards, others as villains or thieves." Now the corners of his mouth tilted up, very slightly. "But I hope you have also seen those with uncommon courage, those who will look evil in the face and say, 'This is where it ends.'" In my mind, I saw Esther again. "I knew such a girl," I mumbled. He reached out to pat me on the shoulder. "I believe I am also looking at such a girl now. History will count you as a hero." I stepped back, unwilling to accept the title. "No, sir, I'm not. Not when compared with those who had made sacrifices far greater than mine. Not when I was far too aware of my flaws, my mistakes, my failures. The world will take notice of what is happening in the ghetto," he said. "Mark my words, it will be a turning point in this war." Maybe I couldn't think of anything that big. I hoped he was right. When the priest clasped his hands in front of me, I happened to notice something curious on his forearm. I gestured at it. So he rolled up the sleeve on his robe enough to show me the prisoner number tattoo there. Auschwitz. Hitler wants no gods other than himself. It was a reminder that hatred runs deeper and wider than any single race or nationality, and if love was not stronger, hatred would run through the generations. I intended to be stronger. The priest offered me a nod of respect, then I returned the gesture as he turned to help the others. It felt good to use proper manners again, like a civilized person. The farmer's wife pulled me aside and tended to my leg wound properly. Infection had begun to set in, and the sewer waters had only made it worse. She had treated the injury with a generous dose of alcohol and then wrapped a new bandage beneath my pant legs. These were new pants, designed for a boy, perhaps with the fit would work. The fit would work after I cinched the waist with a belt. "If you are leaving us, then a dress will blend in better around Warsaw," she said, showing slight disapproval for my choice. "I'll keep the pants," I said. "I won't be in Warsaw for long." "Where are you going?" Yitzhak looked at me for our answer. Behind him I saw Reuben sitting with a few of the children, helping to clean their faces with a small towel and bowl of water. He must have felt my eyes on him, because he smiled over at me. "We'll join the partisans," I told her, and beside me Yitzhak nodded in agreement. The war isn't over, and the fight inside me was as strong as ever. At sunset that evening, Reuben, Yitzhak, and I returned to the truck, along with a few other refugees who had also chosen to come with us to the forest. Before climbing in, Yitzhak and I lingered behind an evergreen tree near the farmer's home. Farther down the street, a church was just releasing its parishioners from Easter services, a worship to mark their deliverance from death. How pretty the women's dresses were, how fine the men's suits. These children had clean faces and full stomachs, and probably hadn't spared a thought this week for the lives of those being lost within sight of this church. Their lives looked normal. I didn't even know what the word meant anymore. But at the end of the exiting group, one couple paused to look in the direction of the ghetto. The air was clean here, but it was impossible to avoid seeing the fires and hearing the occasional round of a machine gun. The wife wiped tears from her eyes, and her husband shook his head and held her close. "What now?" she asked her husband. I was asking myself the same question. Tomorrow we would mark the end of Passover. As Yitzhak and I were saved from the ghetto, we would find a way to save those who could still be saved. Reuben crept up behind us, whispering in my ear that it was time to go. He added, "There's a large group of partisan fighters in the woods outside Warsaw. It's not only Jews, but anyone who is determined to play a role in ending this war." "We'll keep fighting," Yitzhak said. We would fight there for the Drangers and Dolek and for all of Akiva. We would fight for the mother on the train and Wit, that kind man in the woods who sheltered Jews on his farm, and for Abraham, Sarah, and Henrik, and all who died in the Action in Lodz. We would fight for Mordechai and for Zob, and for all those who rose up in the Warsaw Ghetto to defy an entire army of evil. We would fight for my mother, who could no longer fight for herself, and for my father, who gave his last breath in devotion to my mother, and for my sister, who was taken too young and too innocent. And we would fight to honor Esther's life, Esther's courage. I may never again meet anyone as strong as she was. Historians might say that the Jews lost every uprising we attempted in this war, that every resistance movement failed. I disagree. We proved that there was value in faith, there was value in loyalty, and that a righteous resistance was victory in itself, no matter the outcome. We got our 3 lines of history. Afterward, the cafe attack on the night of December 22nd, 1942, was one of the first open attacks of armed resistance by the Jewish people in occupied Europe. Although comparatively small in scale, and despite the Germans' response, which eventually destroyed Akiva's organization in Krakow, it proved to other Jewish groups that resistance was possible. As noted in the story, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was never going to result in victory over the German forces, but the effects of what the Jewish people accomplished there in managing to stave off the Nazis for nearly a month reverberated throughout Poland and all of occupied Europe. Ultimately, the Warsaw Ghetto fighters held out longer than the entire country of Poland did against the initial German invasion. It inspired other uprisings in ghettos such as those in Bedzies and Białystok, and in the extermination camps of Treblinka, Sobibor, and Auschwitz. It also was a foreshadowing and model for the Warsaw Uprising, launched by the Polish Underground Army on August 1st, 1944. Within the world of my imagination, I pictured that Shia was there for that fight too. However, because this is a work of fiction, it is important to separate my characters from the actual people who chose heroism, courage, and honor in the face of certain death. Shia and Esther, their families, and many other people they meet along the way are fictional characters, so as not to intrude upon the personalities or actions of actual people involved. However, many details from their experiences are pulled from true stories. In this book, most of those referenced in leadership positions within the resistance movement actually existed, and where it was possible to quote them exactly, this has been done. Where it was not possible, I attempted to preserve the spirit of their message. The following are some of the many heroic individuals involved in the resistance movement. Akiva, Aharon, Dolek, would have been 27 at the outbreak of World War II. He was described as charismatic and loyal. He was key in organizing the couriers and forming connections with other resistance groups. His motto was to fight for 3 lines in history, even when the outcome was already known. He died in a shootout at the Akiva bunker on December 24th, 1942. Abraham is not mentioned in this book, but was heavily involved with the Akiva raids in the fall of 1942. He died during an attempted prison escape on April 29th, 1943. Antek stepped into the leadership of Akiva after the organization's collapse following the cafe attack. He died in October 1943 during a retaliation strike for the murder of a Jewish child in hiding. Gusta Dranger was the young wife of Shimshon Dranger, and it is thanks to her that we know as much of Akiva's story as we do. After her arrest, she dedicated the story of the resistance to the other women in her prison. After her arrest, she dictated the story of the resistance to the other women in her prison cell. 5 copies each were made on pieces of toilet paper, which were then smuggled out of the prison. Most of the narrative survives, and it was compiled into a book titled Justine's Story. She was killed in November 1943 after fulfilling an agreement with her husband that if either was ever captured by the Nazis, the other would surrender too. Menek Einstein was the youngest Akiva leader and hid in the Tarnow ghetto after the cafe attack. He was killed March 20th, 1943.